Hi, I'm Chris, and I want to teach you about modern Yu-Gi-Oh! This video will be more about deck building concepts and archetypes, but really only a surface level to cover the basics of how modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Presents itself. A lot of these concepts will be easier to understand if you've played other trading card games. Just know that these concepts manifest themselves a little differently in Yu-Gi-Oh! Let's start with non-engine. This term is a little hard to parse, but in other games this would be more commonly referred to as interaction or removal. These are mostly generic cards that are meant to disrupt your opponent in a meaningful way, but these cards typically don't contribute to your actual ability to win the game. This is where the distinction between engine and non-engine becomes more apparent. Your engine is your core game plan, or at least some aspect of it that allows you to put pressure on the opponent and win the game. To think about it another way, if your engine is the way you plan on winning a game, non-engine is what prevents you from losing. Non-engine has manifested itself differently over the course of the game's history and in many different ways. Early on, this would just be the best spells and traps you could be playing at the time, which a lot of the time got banned, but as decks became stronger and stronger, non-engine had to take on different forms to stay relevant. This is where we get our most common types of non-engine in the game today: board breakers and hand traps. Board breakers are fairly easy to understand. They are cards you play with the express purpose of dismantling an opponent's board. Board breakers are valued by the specific method of removal they use, how much your opponent can respond to them, and the sheer amount of cards they can deal with. You know, basic math dictates that if I only use one card to get rid of 3 of yours, I must be doing something right. The problem with board breakers, though, is that they have very little application when going first. Yu-Gi-Oh! Games move at such a blinding speed nowadays, and they can end very quickly. Going first or second drastically changes what is required of you and what you should be working towards, and we'll talk more about that later. Board breakers are great when you go second, because presumably your opponent has already built up their board for you to break. But if you go first, they don't have that, and you're functionally playing with a dead card. You can't always expect the game to swing back around to your turn where you'll be able to use the board breaker. Ideally, you want to have cards that have applications going both first and second. This is where hand traps come in. The term hand trap can sometimes be a little misleading, but effectively they are cards with specific triggers or conditions that are meant to disrupt the opponent as they play, like traps, but they can be activated from the hand when those triggers or conditions come up, including during the opponent's turn. One of the first cards I ever talked about when I started making these videos was Effect Veiler, which is an example of a hand trap. These types of cards give you the benefit of almost always having some kind of use case no matter whose turn it is. If you're going second, these cards can prevent your opponent from fully achieving their game plan, making it easier for you to play the game. And if you're going first, they're just additional pieces of interaction on top of what your deck is already doing. Hand traps are very popular in Yu-Gi-Oh! Most modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Decks play somewhere between 9 and 15 hand traps in a standard 40 card deck, but not all non-engine fits cleanly into these two categories. I'll leave a link in the description to a list of the most common staples in the game. Let's go back to talking about engine, though, because the type of deck you want to play might inform what cards go into your deck. I'm mostly referring to different game styles of play like combo, control, and aggro, but Yu-Gi-Oh! Manifests these styles of play in slightly different ways than most card games. To start, Yu-Gi-Oh! Decks are already some combination of combo, control, and aggro, but the degree to which they embody these elements varies. In most other games, these playstyles have different goals and take different amounts of time to achieve these goals. For Yu-Gi-Oh!, I'm going to describe these game plans in terms of their consistency and their power ceiling. Let's start with combo. Combo decks are very consistent with high ceilings that like going first and aim to output as much interaction as possible. Combo decks aren't trying to achieve a loop that instantly wins like some other games, just establish a board state that effectively does. Combo decks will routinely put out more disruption than an opponent can feasibly deal with, making it easier to deal with them afterwards. Card advantage and resources aren't so much of a concern for these decks, because if your opponent can't play through your board, the game ends right there. There is a certain allure to combo decks that the Yu-Gi-Oh community has a fondness for. 1 card combo, 8 disruptions or more, stuff like that. But in my experience, the more output that a combo deck has, the more likely it is to have cards that the deck doesn't actually need, and the less consistent it can be due to all the additional cards. A lot of the time, cards that are critical to a combo deck's game plan are referred to as garnets or bricks, and they can make combo decks feel much more inconsistent than they actually are. Memento and the Demons from a Different Dimension, yes, that's what that stands for, play a bunch of cards at 1 copy per deck, and you are required to know a bunch of alternate combo pathways to compensate for drawing those cards. And sometimes there are variations in building those decks if you don't like a certain aspect of how they play or what board they are trying to achieve. Also, combo decks can sometimes be a bit fragile. If you can stop a combo player during a critical choke point or prevent them from making some of their powerful boss monsters, they become significantly easier to deal with. Control decks also prefer to go first, but unlike combo decks, Control tends to trade the consistency of its game plan for more individually powerful cards. This makes your strategy less fragile and more sustainable over the course of a game, but the individual pieces of the deck aren't really comparable to the boss monsters combo decks try to end on. Additionally, because Control requires so much setup, it runs the risk of not being prepared for certain situations, like playing into an established board. There is a lot of variance in the ceiling of Control decks because it largely depends on how many of your most powerful cards you've drawn. Card advantage is very important to Control decks because their amount of interaction depends on it. In terms of interaction, at worst, you are trading one of your cards for one of your opponent's. Control decks have to find ways to make this trade work better in their favor with draw engines, recursion, or some other means, or else they won't have the ability to win the game as reliably. Take Labyrinth, for example. Labyrinth, as a deck, is characterized by 2 things. It has a very powerful resource loop that takes advantage of powerful trap cards to gain more card advantage than the opponent over the course of the game, and it can basically search for any trap card in your deck. However, Labyrinth has difficulty using its own cards as interaction against the opponent, and depends on generic powerful trap cards to carry some of that weight. This has created 2 distinct playstyles of Labyrinth: Combo and Stun. I just told you about Combo, but on the furthest end of this Control spectrum we have is Stun. Stun is less of a strategy in Yu-Gi-Oh! And more of a collection of tech cards we call floodgates that are meant to prevent your opponent from playing the game. This has parallels to stacks and hate bears in Magic the Gathering. A dedicated stun deck wants to slow down the game as much as possible with the most oppressive effects you can imagine and dominate the game through snowballing advantage over the course of a few turns. These decks don't necessarily have to worry as much about card advantage because the progression of the game is much slower. Stun cards are very powerful and have huge targets on their heads, so stun decks require both protection for their powerful stun pieces and ways to effectively deal damage to the opponent. Labyrinth, as a strategy, complements stun cards very well, but you could also just perform a combo that searches for a powerful trap that shuts down your opponent in the same way. Aggro is very weird in Yu-Gi-Oh! The closest parallels I can think of are going second decks. As the title implies, these are decks that rather than building a board made to stop any plays from your opponent, are made to break them down and kill the opponent as fast and efficiently as possible. These decks are more likely to play board breakers and have the ability to do lethal damage to the opponent in one turn, sometimes more. Tenpai has the ability to kill your opponent 3 times over. Why does it do that? I don't know, it doesn't need to, it just can. I bring up Tenpai because it also illustrates a frustrating pain point about playing going second decks, and that's the fact that they rarely have the ability to do anything else. OTK decks are really good at doing damage, but not so good at interacting with the opponent. Similar to Control, a lot of weight is put on your non-engine to help you push through established boards. The difference is, if you do not kill your opponent on that turn, you will lose immediately. More often than not, going second decks do not have the tools to interact with your opponent if they live. They also have similar weaknesses to Combo, where you're using a bunch of smaller pieces to make a bigger guy, and if you get interrupted doing that, you lose. And the final nail in the coffin is that almost every deck can do this to some extent. The way that modern Yu-Gi-Oh has shaped out is that almost every deck has the tools available to kill the opponent in one turn without having to be specifically designed to break boards. The trade-off for all of these weaknesses is that going second strategies are very strong. Most decks are not prepared for a strategy that punches them in the mouth for making an underdeveloped board. Board breakers trade versatility for power, and going second decks are extremely efficient at what they do, more so than any deck that just happens to have a combo line that can one-shot an opponent. I love going second. I think it's a very underrated and underserved aspect of the game, but that lack of development means you might be better served playing a mid-range deck. So given all this information about strategies, what is the standard mid-range deck trying to accomplish in Yu-Gi-Oh? Well, as it implies, a little bit of everything. Most decks have a combo they perform with relative consistency, but the benefit of a mid-range deck is that they can modify their strategy and the ceiling of their end board in response to an opponent. A mid-range deck is almost always able to accomplish something. They have a sufficient enough grind game for a card game that only lasts a few turns, and they tend to have tools available to them to help approach any situation on any turn of the game. Their main weaknesses come from a blend of all the other strategies. They can't combo as hard as the combo decks, they rely a lot on their non-engine like the control decks, and they can't always kill as efficiently as the OTK decks. In turn, you get a much more balanced playstyle. In my opinion, most of the meta decks that exist right now can be classified as mid-range decks, primarily K9 and Draco Tail strategies. These decks are unique because the tools in their archetypes blur the lines between engine and non-engine. But these words mean nothing to you, so let's talk about archetypes. Archetypes are some of the most notable and iconic aspects of Yu-Gi-Oh! The original Yu-Gi-Oh! Series is known for having a lot of individually iconic monsters, Dark Magician, Blue Eyes, etc. But many characters would have strategies built around types of monsters. Weevils, insects, Bones, zombies, you get the point. Archetypes work in a similar way, but are connected by name and an overarching theme. The first archetypes ever were Gravekeepers, monsters that were based on Egyptian burial rites and focused around the spell Necro Valley, and Toons, warped versions of monsters born from a magical comic book played by Pegasus. Archetypes can get even crazier and more referential than this, though. My favorite example to show people is Cosmo. Cosmo, on the surface, seems like a random spaceship deck with some weird characters, but then you see cards like this, and this, and this, and you realize, oh, this is like if The Wizard of Oz was also Star Wars. Like, right down to referencing certain scenes and events. The archetype literally has Oz in its name. Many archetypes try to approach the game from a creative or referential angle. Ascend is like if Dark Souls took place during a Pompeii-style event. Super Quantum is a reference to Power Rangers and Super Sentai. Ancient Warriors is the romance of the Three Kingdoms. Evil Twins are VTubers by day and Jewel Thieves by night. Kobayashi's Dragon Maid, Gurren Lagann, Aleister Crowley. I could go on forever. Even crazier is that within the game's mechanics, Yu-Gi-Oh! Will try to replicate certain aspects of what it is referencing during play. Yummy, which is one of the better meta decks right now at the time of writing, is based off of plush toys, desserts, and UFO catcher crane games, which means during the game you are using your UFO catcher to grab treats out of the graveyard back onto the field, and those treats will then give you additional effects. This design space around cards can sometimes be to the game's detriment, like with Flower Guardians, which is based off of Japanese Hanafuda playing cards, so you are literally playing a card game within a card game. This is why in a previous video I talked about how Yu-Gi-Oh! Loves to break its own rules. It primarily does so to create analogies between the card game and its reference material. And if you're not a fan of that, Yu-Gi-Oh! Has even more original archetypes to offer. Another design space for cards is storytelling, or lore archetypes as the community sometimes refers to them as. Lots of storytelling in Yu-Gi-Oh! Is primarily shown through card art and effects that reference other archetypes, or some online text that we get about certain events, which means you can piece together a narrative from cards set by set. The World Legacy is a story about three adventurers that get tricked into releasing unfathomable evil and attempt to fix their mistakes with tragic consequences. Visa Starfrost is a guy who, Kingdom Hearts style, splits himself into multiple beings and has to travel to multiple planets to collect the pieces of himself again in a sort of Buddhist samsara metaphor. Every few years we get a new storyline to follow. The current lore archetype right now is Art Mage, which is like a creative arts school for wizards with powerful monsters as patrons, but right now it's just started and we don't really know where it's all going. If the story of cards is interesting to you, it can be fun to keep track of them as these sets come out. But I think most people get into Yu-Gi-Oh! From whatever associated anime they watched, and that's where legacy support comes in. As I said earlier, Yu-Gi-Oh! Has a lot of iconic monsters, and lots of people would like to play a dedicated Dark Magician deck. So every few years, Konami will make cards that specifically reference Dark Magician or some other famous monsters that create or revive a playstyle surrounding those cards. That, in essence, is legacy support. This can create some weird wording in the text of cards, like you can add one Dark Magician or one card that mentions it from your deck to your hand, and we're not even going to go over the rules implications of text like that. But legacy support doesn't just apply to old monsters. It's also the way older archetypes and strategies receive newer support as years go by. If you are dedicated to a specific archetype, or maybe a specific type of monster, odds are, sooner or later, you will get to play that deck again with newer cards. And I think that's cool. It means there is truly something for everyone that plays Yu-Gi-Oh!, no matter what you are interested in. Thank you for watching. If you found this video helpful in any way, please tell me about it below. Please like and subscribe, share the video around to people who also might want to see it, and I'll see you next time. Thank you.